Good evening, everyone. As usual, I like to start by honoring all of those who've gone before us and cleared our path, but especially the Sawamish upon whose land we stand. And tonight, Jean Durning, one of our diversity awareness members, has so wonderfully brought us our program, and she will be introducing him. Jean?
Thank you, Sally. It is an honor to be introducing Thomas Gray, a person who has been honored in many ways, including by the Washington State Legislature early this year. You remember, state legislature doesn't stay in session for very long. So it was last January or February that they passed a memorial in honor of Thomas Gray for his extraordinary service to aeronautic engineering here in Seattle and in Washington State, and for all his work in his support outside of his career in helping other people. It's being from the legislature, it's all full of whereas, and then another paragraph of whereas, and another paragraph of telling you all the wonderful things that he has done. I will simplify it by saying that he was involved in the testing of the 737, the 747. Actually, he was the first non-pilot to fly in a 747 in its first practice run. The 757, the 767, and his opportunities went on because he worked also on the space shuttle, the landing system for the space shuttle. But what you're about to hear about tonight is his work as a volunteer, where he has been very active for 30 years approximately at the Museum of Flight as a docent. He has also been working with young people, trying to encourage them to go into flying or into aeronautics as a field that they could move into, and a group of young flyers called the Red Tails, which perhaps he will tell you about. And what we're here to hear about, the history of the Tuskegee Airmen. There are no more people who were airmen, actual Tuskegee students people who got their training at Tuskegee Institute who are still alive, who are living in the Northwest, if I understand right. But that was a long time ago. And it's very important that the history is pursued. And we have also a friend of his who works as the historian of the local chapter of the group that is supporting the history of the Tuskegee Airmen. And so if you want to say anything, Harvey, that will be a chance later on. And I will very happily turn this microphone over to Tom Gray. Can we welcome him? Okay.
There it is. Okay, I think we got it now. Well, first of all, I want to say Happy Veterans Day to all the veterans here. I started my career out in the New Mexico Air National Guard before I came to work for Boeing. When I got out of school, I went to Lackland to start in the Air Force and joined the New Mexico Guard, and then immediately transferred back to the Washington Air National Guard when I came to work for Boeing. I was employed in 1961 by the Boeing company. So I wanted to, when I came to Seattle, I did not know that there were that many Tuskegee Airmen here in the Seattle area. My contact with the Tuskegee Airmen started as a child in New Mexico. During this Second World War, I remember I was 4 years old when the lady across the street came running across the street just screaming that the Japanese were bombing Pearl Harbor. And of course, at the time, I did not know who the Japanese were. I did not know what bombs were. And I sure as heck didn't know where Pearl Harbor was. But I kind of demarcated the beginning of my existence from that day on, from the rationing stamps to the paper drives to the war movies that my parents took me to. And my life was kind of dictated by what was happening in the war at the time. I do remember my grandmother waking me up on July 16th, 45, and she said, "What was that?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "The whole north wall of the bedroom lit up there in Albuquerque." And I said, "Well, it must be lightning." And she says, "No, there's not a cloud in the sky." And the next day, the Albuquerque Journal said that an ammunition dump had blown up in Alamogordo, New Mexico. We did not realize that that was the beginning of the atomic age. There was a lot of activity going on at the time, but things were so secret around the area. I remember my grandfather, who was a brakeman, used to come in and say that they took one of these trains that they dropped off in Santa Fe, New Mexico, that had security guards on both ends. And we just know that it was taking it up north of Santa Fe, but we did not know about Los Alamos at the time. So that was kind of the era that I grew up in. I went to school there in Albuquerque, and I always used to say I was an Albuquerque High Bulldog. I went to the University of New Mexico, which were Lobos, which is the Mexican wolf. And after I came to Seattle, I became a Husky. So my wife always used to tell me that you've been a dog all your life. So I happen to be, just briefly, I have to tell you that I came to Seattle to work on the dynamic soaring vehicle, which was called the X-20 at the time. This was a space vehicle they were going to put on top of a Titan rocket and send it off into space. This would have been a precursor to the space shuttle. It turns out that 6 months after I got here, they canceled that program and went to the Mercury capsule type. And the people I were working with were old B-52 test engineers, and they suggested that I go over and interview and flight test where they were building airplanes. And of course, I was kind of disappointed because I came with the idea of going into space. And you mean I got to go work on plane airplanes? But it turned out to be a good move, because I sort of got in on the beginning of the space age. And so I managed to work in the marine system for a short while. Boeing built some hydrofoils. So I did not work on the 727 because Boeing was building hydrofoil aircraft, hydrofoil vehicles at the time, and we had several different vehicles. We had a Fresh One, which was a foil research vehicle. It had a B-52 engine that propelled this, what looked like an airplane cab, and had two pontoons, and then it had the foil structure. And we used to run up and down Puget Sound testing Fresh One with this jet-powered vehicle. It did sit over in front of the battleship Missouri before it went to Hawaii, and someone in Brunswick, Missouri bought that vehicle. So if I want to see my old test vehicle, I have to go to Brunswick, Missouri. I happened to be going by a meeting one time. There were one of the gentlemen came out and told me that they were Tuskegee Airmen and that I should join the group. And of course I said, well, wait, I'm not familiar with I'm not a Tuskegee Airman. And they said, well, you just have to be interested. And when I was a kid, my only contact with the Tuskegee Airmen was with a fellow named Omer Blair. Omer Blair lived in Albuquerque, and he had gone off to Tuskegee. And he came home in this snazzy Air Force outfit with his little garrison cap and a brown jacket and these khaki pants. And I thought that was a very snappy outfit. And he told me that he was off learning to fly in a place called Tuskegee, Alabama, which I knew nothing about. That was my first contact that I've heard that something was going on at Tuskegee. And of course, when I came to Seattle, I wound up meeting something like 17 people or so that were Tuskegee Airmen. Now, to my right, I have a poster that shows the Tuskegee Airmen that lived here in the Northwest. And I got a chance to meet most of the people on this poster. And in fact, I think everyone on this poster now is gone. The black pilots in World War II had a difficult time because the American War College had said that blacks were not capable, did not have the skill or whatever to fly airplanes. And so there were no blacks in the budding Air Corps of the United States. They did not take into account the fact that we had someone like Eugene Bullard, who actually flew in the First World War with the French. We did have soldiers that had fought in the First World War. We had women like Bessie Coleman, who had to go to France to get her certificate to fly. And of course, she came back and was unfortunately lost her life. We had several schools that part of the civilian pilot training program. We had several schools that were actually teaching people to fly. I have to thank Harvey Hawks. I used some of his, Harvey Hawks does a Tuskegee Airmen presentation at the Museum of Flight once a month. And some of the slides that I were looking for are on his presentation. And so, Harvey, I took the liberty of using one of your presentation slides. They talked first about the Tuskegee experiment. And President Roosevelt at the time had been pressured to allow the black pilots into the program, and he had been pressured by several of the black newspapers. There were papers like the Chicago Defender and I guess there was a Baltimore, I don't know the Baltimore plane, and there's a Pittsburgh Courier, and then there was a Baltimore American, I think it was. These papers had been pushing FDR to allow the black pilots to fly. And of course, FDR was in the middle of getting ready for his, I think it was third term. And so he was thinking that in order to get the black vote, that he would encourage this program. And of course, after he got elected, I think he forgot about it for a while. His wife, Eleanor, had an occasion to go down to the Tuskegee area, and while she was there, she asked Chief Alfred Anderson if he would take her up on a flight. And of course, the Secret Service immediately had a problem with that. They called back to FDR and said that Eleanor wanted to go up on in this airplane, and what should they do? And they said, well, the president apparently told her she could do whatever she wanted to. So Eleanor took a ride with Chief Anderson. I have a static display back there in the back, which has a picture of Eleanor in the airplane with Chief Anderson. An interesting aside on that is I understand that Chief Anderson has a son that lived or lives on Mercer Island. He was an artist, and I had an occasion where the museum wanted me to take his grandson on one of the tours, but for some reason that didn't happen. But I think Chief Anderson does have a relative that's in the area that probably remains to remain unknown. I will go down through, well, first of all, I wanted to mention the pilot training program. There were several schools that had this program, and they were, there was Delaware State, the Tuskegee, of course, and the other, West Virginia also had a school. There was a school in West Virginia, and they all had civilian pilot training programs. And this is where black people were able to learn to fly airplanes. I'll go on to talk about the 99th Pursuit Squadron. I want to talk about Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. And then, of course, we talk about the 332nd Fighter Group. And we talk about the bombing escort missions that the Tuskegee Airmen did. And then we'll talk about the final victory, which is when President Truman actually signed Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the Air Force. Now, I mentioned Mrs. Roosevelt's ride with Chief Anderson, of course. And in June of that year, they decided to establish a primary flying school at Tuskegee, Alabama. And here's a map showing Montgomery, and it was about 40 miles, I guess, east of Montgomery. Now, when they started this program, they were thinking, with it being in the South, that it probably would fail because of the fact that the South would be not hospitable to having black flyers. And so that was not one of the reasons that they felt that it might, well, that was one of the reasons they felt it might fail. This is a picture of Moton Field. This had to be developed at the time. They had another field there called Kennedy 1 that showed up in the literature. But Moton Field was the Tuskegee Airmen field they had to actually build for the airmen. the Air Force decided that they would have Noel Parrish be their commander. Noel Parrish was from Kentucky, and he became their primary advocate. And of course, at their one of their graduations, he expected them not to fail. And all of the Tuskegee Airmen to the date admire Noel Parrish as being one of their strongest advocates. This is a picture of some of the Tuskegee Airmen that were training at Moton Field. And here's one of their aircraft. They had several aircraft. They did their primary training usually in a Cub plane, and then they went to basic training in the P-19s, and eventually they did their advanced training in AT-6s, which is called the Texan. There's the AT-6. Now, I have to stop here because you see Cadet William Holloman in an AT-6 trainer. Bill Holloman had quite an impact on the Tuskegee Airmen here in Seattle, and he was one of the few people I met when I first came. He was a strong advocate at the Museum of Flight, and I had occasions to take him to several lectures, a lecture over in Centralia. And if you notice, he's 18 years old there. And he was one of the younger pilots. I remember him telling me one of the stories. He actually went to New Orleans for one of the World War II museum openings. And he told me that when he was a cadet, they were in New Orleans and they went to a restaurant called Dookie Chase. A lady, I guess, ran Dookie Chase. And at the time, he was too young to drink. He said when he was back in New Orleans, some 70 years later, he went back to the same restaurant and the lady was there, and he asked her if he was old enough now. I understand. I heard a news item that the lady just passed just recently. I think it was on one of the Sunday morning programs. I heard that the lady that was in charge of that restaurant just passed. So I think that's probably the same lady that Bill Holloman met. I have to mention, Bill Holloman, of course, is on this chart over here. He actually had a commercial license, not only in the United States, but in Canada. He also had license in France and Germany. He was a helicopter pilot. He was the first black helicopter pilot in the U.S. Air Force. And he actually served in 3 wars. He served in World War II. He served in Korea, and he was also called back during Vietnam. And he passed just a few years ago. In fact, when they had his service here in Kent, they managed to come up with 4 P-51s, one of which was Paul Allen's P-51. And they did a missing man formation down over the Kent Valley for Bill Holloman. So we miss him. Prior to the first deployment to Europe, this is the original 99th Pursuit Squadron. And in the middle, you'll see Benjamin O. Davis. Benjamin O. Davis was a commissioned officer, and of course, he was one of the first black graduates at West Point in the 20th century. His father was also a general. And Benjamin O. Davis had to put up with a silent treatment while he was at West Point. They would not talk to him except in the professional aspects. And so I remember he told a story of going to a meeting where they were going to discuss what they were going to do about Benjamin O. Davis. And it's interesting that William Westmoreland of the West Point fame was one of his classmates at the time. And I understand Benjamin O. Davis graduated in 11th in his class. Here's a picture of Tuskegee Airmen class in front of a P-35 Aero Cobra. Now, the Aero Cobra, the Tuskegee Airmen did not fly with very long. I think they only flew those about 9 months. And I don't think they even flew those in combat. But they wound up selling those to the Russians. The Russians liked them because it had a cannon in the nose there. And so the airplanes, I didn't mention the Tuskegee Airmen actually flew the P-40 at Tuskegee, and that was the airplane that they wound up taking to North Africa. Here's a picture of the 99th on location, and it doesn't say where they are, so I don't know if they're in Sicily or not. There are the Curtiss P-40s on line in North Africa. Now, the U.S. 12th Air Force did not want to take on the black flyers. But fortunately, the 15th Air Force did say they would take them on. And so they flew with the 15th Air Force. And they were stationed in North Africa. And at about this time, one of the generals was saying, well, the Tuskegee Airmen hadn't shot down any airplanes. They were probably cowards, and there was no glory there. But of course, the Germans were leaving North Africa at that time, and the Germans did not have that much air power in the North Africa. And so they did not have anything to shoot at. But they did, the invasion of Sicily followed shortly, and Charles P. Hall was the first African-American to wound up shooting down a German aircraft. And of course, they moved into Italy, and of course, about this time, the Anzio invasion came up. The Italians, I think, had surrendered about this time, and that's when the Germans started sending their troops down into Italy. And we had I think it was Mark Clark's group did the Anzio invasion, and this is when the Tuskegee Airmen came out, because they actually shot down something like 16 German airplanes during the Anzio invasion. Yeah, this is a picture of the boot of the heel of Italy, in southern Italy. And this was the area that the 15th Air Corps operated in. Here we show the flight leader, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, in his Republic 47 Thunderbolt. The Tuskegee Airmen moved over from the P-40s to the P-47, and the P-47 was a very heavily armored airplane. It had something like 4 machine guns in each wing, and this shows Davis with next to his P-47. And of course, later the P-51 came on the scene, and the Tuskegee Airmen were able to start flying those airplanes. I'd like to turn over now to Sam Bruce. Sam Bruce, who I have a chart over there to my left, was actually a Garfield High graduate. He graduated in 1936. He went to school in the Rainier Valley. He was born in Crockett, Texas, and his folks came to Seattle. And when I first came to Seattle, I knew the chapter was named after Sam Bruce, but I didn't know anything about him. And so I was at one of the conventions, and I ran into a person that researched missing people, and I'd mentioned to him that I did not know about Sam Bruce. And the next day, he came back with these yellow pages of the flight report talking about the demise of Sam Bruce in January of '44. And it was he was in one of the early classes, 42G, I guess. And there's a picture of Sam Bruce at Tuskegee, Alabama, with Eldridge Williams, who was also one of the cadets there at the time. And I actually ran into Eldridge Williams at one of the conventions. And here is Sam Bruce's class. He's the second one from the left up there on. He had actually flown a mission, and I have before me the write-up. Excuse me just a second. I have a write-up here that was written by Sergeant Peter Bertram wrote this item up for the month of January of '44, and in it he says, "We lost 3 pilots this month. First of all, he said Lieutenant John Morgan was injured when he crashed upon landing on January the 2nd, and he died in the hospital the following day. Then he mentioned Second Lieutenant William Griffin was last seen smoking and diving at 2,000 feet while on a dive bombing mission. And then it says First Lieutenant Samuel F. Bruce was killed in action. He was last seen chasing FW-190s in the assault area south of Rome." Now, the fellow also brought out a death certificate that showed that Sam Bruce was buried in Italy. And he gave the cemetery and said he was buried between a sailor and a U.S. Army Ranger. And then he showed me paperwork with his mother where they requested, "Do you want Sam Bruce left in Italy, or would you like to have him brought back?" And she did request that Sam Bruce be brought back and in 1944, Sam Bruce's remains were brought back to Salt Lake City, and he's presently buried up in the Bellewood section of West Shelley Cemetery. And the Sam Bruce chapter, we usually go out on Memorial Day to see Sam Bruce's grave site, and it does have 99th Fighter Squadron on his headstone. An interesting aside to that was I worked in Boeing with a fellow that was a veteran that flew B-24s in Italy at the same time. And he used to tell the story of how they would like to listen to the Red Tail Flyers because they were talking trash back in '40. I mean, we think rap just came in. They were talking this rap while they were flying, and he mentioned that he used to like to listen to conversation on his mission as a navigator. And this fellow's name was Charles Beard. He served in Korea, and he told me that he was on a flight to Korea, and there was a Tuskegee Airman on the airplane with him. And he asked, he was telling him this same story that Sam Bruce there was a pilot that was saying that he was chasing some fox wolves, and he had 3 of them cornered, and he needed help. And he told this story to the fellow he was flying to Korea with, and the guy said, "Oh yeah, that was so-and-so, he got shot down." And when I heard that story, I was wondering, could he possibly have heard the last words of Sam Bruce? Because Sam Bruce was off chasing fighters. Now, why he was chasing fighters by himself, I don't know where his wingman was or whatever. But anyway, it just that these 2 stories seem to have dovetailed. And I said, in the fog of war, it's highly possible that he heard the last words of Sam Bruce. Sam Bruce's death certificate said that apparently his parachute had failed to open. So when he bailed out, he apparently was, to me, that meant he was probably too close to the ground when he bailed out. And so that was the reason his parachute did not open. But anyway, Sam Bruce is who our chapter is named after. And so I wanted to tell that story, and his picture is shown there in the middle of that poster there. We'll go on to another person, Lucky Lester. He had actually 3 victories in one day. And they show a picture of him with the 3 swastikas painted on his airplane. I put this slide in because this shows the Tuskegee Airmen putting on a fuel tank on a P-51. I mentioned earlier Omer Blair, who was my hometown hero. He was a warrant officer with the Tuskegee Airmen. And when they told the P-51 pilots for the Tuskegee Airmen that they were going to have to fly to Berlin, they were going to have to use extra fuel tanks. And Omer Blair actually wound up stopping a train that was bringing the fuel tanks down to another white outfit, and actually took these fuel tanks off the train. And of course, the Tuskegee Airmen keep calling that the Great Train Robbery. And but they were able to put these fuel tanks on to continue their mission to Berlin. And now we're talking about a 5-hour mission, 5 or 6 hour mission, where the P-51s had to actually follow the airplane, the bombers. And Benjamin O. Davis had given them strict instructions that they should stick with the airplanes. They were not supposed to go off glory chasing, shooting down airplanes, and the Germans had a habit of sending in decoy airplanes, and then when the fighters would leave them, they would send in a second detachment to attack the bombers. And so they got on, the Tuskegee Airmen were onto that early. So here's a picture of Benjamin O. Davis and his father pinning on a Distinguished Flying Cross. There's the second person in line there. I don't know who the second person is, but the third person his name is Jack Holsclaw. He was actually from Spokane, Washington. And this medal was being pinned on them because they apparently had attacked they say a German destroyer. And of course, we have talked about some of the things that, misconceptions about the Tuskegee Airmen. And they have said many times that the Tuskegee Airmen had sank a German destroyer. It turns out that destroyer happened to belong to the Italians. It was one that the Germans had taken away from the Italians. And it did not sink, but it was damaged enough that it had to be taken out of commission. So the fact is that they did not sink a destroyer. There was a similar misconception about the fact that for a long while they said the Tuskegee Airmen had not lost a bomber under their escort, and it turns out that wasn't true. I know there was something, I'd heard the number, there were something like 300 bombers were lost, but only 7 of those could be attributed to the escort duty of the Tuskegee Airmen. So they were very, very careful about their protecting their wards. This shows a P-51 overwork over Germany. There were several German jets, the Me-262, that were actually shot down by Tuskegee Airmen that were flying the P-51s. Now, we're talking about a slower airplane, but of course they were probably a lot more maneuverable. So if the jet missed you, they could cut you off at the pass. There was a Tuskegee Airman named Roscoe Brown who actually, I was at a convention in Dallas, and he was signing a model for a kid, and I told the kid, I said, you know, he shot down a German jet, and Roscoe Brown stopped and looked up at me and said, I shot down 2 of those suckers. So I'm not sure how much that story was, but I know that the 2 of the Tuskegee Airmen had actually downed the German jet. And here's another bomber escort, and that's a B-24 Liberator, and that's the kind my friend Chuck Beard was navigator on. There's quite a bit of art, and we of course, you've probably heard of several of the movies. There was an HBO movie that came out years ago with Williams. Bob Williams was a producer of that. And I was in Atlanta when they premiered that movie. And it was interesting sitting in the audience because you kept hearing people saying, hey, that's not true, or that didn't happen that way, or whatever. But I said, well, hey, it's a movie. And of course, we had the Red Tail movies, which George Lucas just produced, which is more recent. And Bill Holloman was actually a consultant on that. He said he was a consultant for 3 or 4 days before they fired him, because Bill Holloman was pretty opinionated. But anyway, he was when they filmed that movie over in Prague. They had to film it over in Prague where they had less telephone poles or whatever. And so anyway, Bill Holloman was a consultant on that movie. I have to mention that about Bill. Now, of course, when the last class graduated from in '46, and one of the people on the screen over there is Eddie Drummond. Eddie Drummond was in the last class of the Tuskegee Airmen, and I remember he said he had to go into the office, and they thought they were going to send him home, and somebody looked in the paperwork and found out that you couldn't dismiss any from the service until they had been in for 90 days. And so Eddie Drummond managed to stay in. Ed Drummond wound up going to Korea, and he actually flew jets in Korea. I know they gave him a choice of flying the P-51, which he'd flown while he was training, but he told him he'd like to fly the jets. And so he wound up flying the F-86, I know, in Korea. I want to mention again Jim Wiley. Jim Wiley was when I came to Boeing, he was an Air Force plant representative here. I remember passing him in the hall with his colonel insignia and his blue uniform, and I did the obligatory black nod as we went by, but I never occurred to ask Jim Wiley what he did during the war. And he actually was working at Boeing. He was still in the Air Force. His daughter told a story about how he tried to get a job in Chicago. And he was in the office for the interview, and the people left the office, turned the lights out, and left him sitting there. And this is the kind of thing that many of the airmen, they were all qualified, but they could not get jobs with the airlines. And it wasn't much better when I came to work for Boeing, because there was a fellow named Marlon Green who tried to get a job with, he was Air Force veteran. He tried to get a job with Continental Airlines in Denver. And he went through quite a series of court cases, and it actually wound up in the U.S. Supreme Court before Marlon Green ever got a job with Continental Airlines. And we're talking about the early 60s. I was just recently at the Organization of Black Airline Pilots in Tacoma, and there were over 300 black pilots there, one of who happened to be Kimberly Scott Ford, who's sitting in the audience here, who just received an honor. She was honored in their Hall of Fame. And I was just amazed that they had that many male black pilots, because there were any number of female black pilots. And I can remember when, while I was still working at Boeing, the female pilots were having a hard time getting a job. And so it was really, really quite amazing to see how long we've come. Now I wanted to go on to this post-war activity. The last class I mentioned to you was graduated in '46, and Ed Drummond was one of those. And of course the Army Air Corps turned into the U.S. Air Force, and the 332nd Fighter Group turned into a fighter wing. In fact, it was stationed in, I think it was in Iraq, if that's not correct. Kimberly Scott served in Iraq. She flew C-17s, I have to mention that. And that fighter wing is still in existence. Of course, '48, President Truman signed the Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the Air Force. And of course, they mentioned in May '49, the Air Force had a gunnery meet in Las Vegas. And I came up with this picture. This was the Tuskegee Airmen. They competed in this meet. They called it the William Tell meet or whatever. And anyway, you'll see 4 of the airmen there. The third person from the left is Harry Stewart. Harry Stewart just passed just a few months ago. He wrote a book called Soaring to Glory. And I like to tell the story about Harry Stewart. It was Easter Sunday, April '45, that he actually downed 3 airplanes in 15 minutes. I was telling this story to my docents, and one of them piped up and said, "Well, what took him so long?" He actually shot down 2, and these were some of the premier German airplanes at the time. Hitler wished he had had more at the time. I think the Fox 190. And the third one was chasing him, and of course he was flying the P-51, and he dove down and pulled out over this hill, and the German airplane that was chasing him crashed into the hill. So they gave him credit for that aircraft. So the other living airman right now is James Harvey. He's the second one to the left there. He lives in Denver, and he was not a red tail. He did not go overseas, but he was at this gunnery meet. And he's one of the few remaining Tuskegee Airmen. And just recently we heard about George Hardy passed. George Hardy, they actually found the P-51 that George Hardy flew in England. And this is about three or 4 years ago. And they invited George Hardy over to England, which they feted him royally. And he got a chance to see the airplane that he actually flew during the Second World War. It's in a museum there in England. Now there you see a P-51, and behind that you see a T-7A. This is a Red Hawk airplane, T-7A, and this is the new training plane that the Air Force has built, or it's being built by the Air Force, and I think Boeing has a contract on this. Anyway, the Red Tails are still flying, and that's what the current Air Force pilots are training in. And they've named it the Red Hawks. So I'm not sure how many other stories I can come up with, but I guess I'll stop here and ask if there are any questions that I can answer. If I can't, I have Harvey Hawks here, who is also our historian for the Tuskegee Airmen.
Let me ask Harvey Hawk if you would stand and let everybody see who it is that we're referring to about Harvey Hawk, the historian for this chapter.
My name is Harvey. I'm also a docent at the Museum of Flight. And Tom did a great job on, there were 996 Tuskegee Airmen that graduated, and every one of them has a story. So we could keep you here all month just telling the stories of these men. But I really appreciate this audience here. And if you do have any questions, just fire away.
I have a mic, so I'm going to ask my question first.
Okay.
I had an opportunity to have dinner with Tom and also another member of the Tuskegee support group. And I understand that there was a memorial that was supposed to be built to the Tuskegee Airmen, and then it became a political football. And so I'd like to know what has happened to that Tuskegee memorial.
No, I don't know if you're referring to the one at the museum at the Air Force Academy.
Yes.
Yeah, there is a memorial that is supposed to be. They do have a statue there, but this is another memorial that was proposed for the Air Force Academy, and I don't know the status. I guess we could ask one of the graduates.
Yeah, she's got it.
I'm Kim Scott Ford, and I'm a 90 graduate. And so as a class project, the classes of 90 and I believe like 72, we raised almost $1 million. We're going to have, we named our airfield General Davis Field. This is about maybe 5 years ago. So all of the cadets who are doing parachuting and gliders, they get to honor our Tuskegee Airmen as well as with the statue at the airfield. It was really sad. We weren't able to mention the airmen for a while as a result of everything that's been going on. So we couldn't discuss any of their amazing accomplishments. Thankfully, there was a large public outcry. And so their experiences were added back to the curriculum for the Air Force and the Air Force Academy. But I will say, sadly, there are a lot of other women and other very deserving people who have been deleted online, and we're not able to mention. They're trying to save this history, and hopefully they'll be able to put it back online. But back to the memorial, we had the groundbreaking about a month ago. I went down for my class reunion. I was one of the people who presented one of those giant checks on the football field. We broke ground. It should take approximately 4 years to build. It'll have 2 airplanes on a stick. One is a P-51, and I'm not sure actually what the other airplane is, but I could find out. So in a few years, we'll be able to go down and see the aircraft and go down to General B.O. Davis Field. So it's a very exciting project, and our visitors and our cadets will be able to continue to learn this important history.
I have a question for you. My father was in the Navy during the Second World War, and when he came back from the Navy, he decided to learn how to fly. 1953, I think it was, 1954. And we lived in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and there was a Hatbox Field there. It was not a commercial airport. But I later did some research and discovered that a Tuskegee Airman was the pilot, the teacher of the pilots, of the people who were learning there. How would I find more information about that? I mean, you probably know where all the Tuskegee Airmen have gone.
Yeah, we have several rosters, and I know if you could come up with a name, we could go back and check some of the rosters. But I'm not sure. Knowing the location, if he was from Oklahoma, it could be that we could narrow it down that way.
And I'd find you at the Museum of Flight.
Oh, the Museum of Flight. It's a good contact, right? Mm-hmm. Your question over here.
I have a question about the name, the Red Tails. Can you tell us anything about how they came to get that name and how all the airplanes that they had a red tail?
Yeah, the story I got was that was the only paint in the paint locker.
Over here, Tom.
This is more of a share, but my husband's parents, his dad was a retired general, retired at a place like this in Washington, D.C. And at table, when we were at, his mother was at in the assisted care, sat Benjamin Davis, who was pretty far gone down the spectrum. And he had a wife who looked something like Yoda. But she was on him all the whole time. And he was always like unbuttoning his shirt or moving his silverware. And she'd say, put that back on and button your shirt up and everything like that. And after a while, I said to her, well, you just do such a great job with your husband. And she looked at me and she said, 74-15 or something like that. So it was kind of interesting to see the aged general. He looked beautiful. He was a gorgeous man and carried himself like a general, living in and seeing him at the end of his life. I have a book that we found in a restaurant in Anacortes. They had books that you could just pick off the shelf where you were sitting and buy, and I found his biography. Do you think the museum has a copy of that, or would you like ours?
Yeah, I probably have. If it's Benjamin O. Davis's book, I do have his book. So.
Yeah, okay, good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I just want to put a cap on what my wife said, because the bottom line was at the nursing station when we would come, and I would Benjamin Davis and his wife and my mother and I would come and have lunch with them, and I was reading out loud Harry Potter to the whole business, and General Davis had not spoken for 3 months. And but at the beginning, when all the owls are coming down, he suddenly perked up and he says, they must give that boy his mail. And it actually took him right up. He was still alive, and he said, "You can't do that." I said, "Don't worry, General. It's going to turn out fine." He says, "Okay, read on." But he was still there. That's my top of what my wife said. It was great to have his acquaintance and to learn about his life, which was out of the autobiography, which really gives you a good idea of the difficulties that blacks had in integrating into all of the services and getting the responsibility of it.
Over the years, I've heard many and read many accounts of the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II, and the statistics were absolutely astonishing. The number of German planes they shot down, the number of pilots who came back safely was absolutely astonishing, and compared very, very well with the regular Air Force. I was hoping that you would give us some of those statistics, the numbers of successful raids and so on.
I hadn't got to my mission card, so and I'm glad you asked that question. So this gave me a reason to use my mission card. The two cards I had at the bottom of my list were the awards that the Tuskegee Airmen had gotten, and the one that I have here is the aerial victories. They actually destroyed 111 airplanes. And they damaged 25. I don't know how they figured that out, but they had a total of 130 aircraft that they had damaged. They also mentioned they had let's see, what is this? They talked about boxcars. They destroyed something like 56 boxcars, and 561 were damaged. And of course, they tried to say they talked about they damaged that destroyer, and I also wanted to mention the fact that they say they flew. Now I don't know the difference between missions and sorties, but they have when they were with the 12th Air Force, they had something like 1,267 missions, and when they were with the 15th Air Force, they have a 311, and then with they had sorties. With the 12th, they had 6,381 sorties, and with the 15th Air Force, they had 9,152 sorties. So I don't know if you Air Force people can tell me the difference between a sortie and a mission. I'm not sure what the difference is. Maybe Kim.
I think a mission could have multiple sorties. Like a mission might be to fly from here to the East Coast and back, so that would be 2 sorties. Or that's just
I see.
An example.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm glad you asked that question. I also wanted to mention the fact, a lot of you knew that the Tuskegee Airmen received a gold medal. One of the things that George Bush and Nancy Pelosi had a ceremony where they actually received a gold medal. They also gave one to the women flyers recently too, so they were making up for lost time here. So.
Oh, how active is the parish family at the Tuskegee Airmen conferences?
Yeah, no, we lost. I mentioned Noel Parish. They have a Noel Parish Award that they give out at each one of the Tuskegee Airmen conventions. In fact, one of Noel Parish's family lives a few years ago lived up in Bellingham. We had some relatives of Noel Parish here, and they still give out the Noel Parish Award. And of course, his wife has since passed, but they still remember Noel Parish with the award. Okay, well, I thank you all for coming, and this has been quite a privilege, and I've enjoyed talking to you all.